This video is for Unit 6, Coaching for Performance and Fitness as part of BTEC's Board and Exercise Science. It specifically looks at how coaches present practices to develop skills and techniques and tactics for performers. So it's B1 and B2 on your spec. This is the first of two assignments which prepares you for the third assignment, which is to plan and deliver and reflect upon a coaching session yourself. So it's worth being aware of the assessment criteria available for this assignment and what you've got to do with the content. As you can see, P3 says explain the practices, analyse practices, evaluate practices in terms of their practicality, suitability and effectiveness. So you've got to explain, analyse and evaluate your examples using these specific criteria: practicality, suitability, effectiveness. And this relates to practices for skills, for techniques and tactics and for fitness. Again, a bit of guidance. So when we assess your work, this is the guidance we have. So for high standard work, you need to evaluate the practices in relation to those criteria. Making judgments. So evaluation means saying, what are the advantages of this practice? Are there any disadvantages or limitations of this as a practice? For who? For what type of skills or tactics? Here's the specification content for B1, practices to develop skills and techniques for performance, and B2, practices to develop tactics for performance. So there are three types of practice situation for practicing skills and techniques, and two for tactics. Both of them need to be evaluated using those criteria. Now, very, very briefly, some sort of terminology and language and principle to understand is that in theory, you are born with some inherited characteristics that are your abilities. Things like flexibility, coordination, power, endurance. For example, the muscle fibers that you're born with, you can't particularly change. You can train them, but you can't change the type. Will predispose you to being really good at endurance or better at power or strength. And you need these abilities to enable you to perform skills in specific sports. These abilities are not sport specific. They are just give you the capacity and potential to perhaps be really good if you train and refine skills in certain sports. Skills, on the other hand, are things that you learn, and the more you practice them, you become more consistent at being able to execute those skills. Skills have defined sort of names, if you like. A forehand in tennis is a defined action. It's not a random movement. It's got a recognizable name, if you like. And when you are skillful and you've learnt them really well, you can execute these skills and look beautifully fluent and controlled. You can repeat them effortlessly. And these skills can be motor skills, the physical movements, or more cognitive, the way you think and make decisions, or more perceptual, the way you interpret information, around you in a match. You weigh up what's going on and you translate the information, you perceive the information, and you cognitively make decisions. So you have to learn to be better at those things in specific sports. It's worth very briefly being aware of these skills classifications as well. So a skill could be a more fine motor skill, something that needs precision, small muscle groups, small movements, refinement, or more gross motor, as in big actions, big muscle group contractions. This is a continuum. It is a sort of an imaginary line, imaginary scale. So skills can be anywhere along this continuum. Now, depending on what they're like in terms of these characteristics, these continua, you might practice them in different ways or have to coach them in different ways. I think this bottom one in particular is really relevant to practice situations. Is a skill open? Passing in any of our sports is an open skill. That means it's affected by environmental things. What's going on around you? Who else is near you? Who's free? Who's running towards you? So you've got to weigh up things going on in the environment, meaning the things in your immediate vicinity. Or is the skill more closed, like a javelin throw or a free throw or a penalty, where there's more limited impact on other people? Just again for a little bit of clarity, skills are learnt, but we can apply different techniques to a skill. So for example, high jump, I can get over the bar. High jump is the skill, but I can do it in multiple different ways, having different techniques. A forehand is a skill, but I can execute a forehand using different techniques, different grips, different swings. A slice, a topspin, they are different techniques of the same skill. Tactics is something that you need to account for in these practice situations, and we'll have to teach players to improve at and to be able to execute in competition. These are things, strategies that you apply in performance to try to give you some kind of advantage. Of course, there can be offensive strategies, defensive strategies, it can be part of set plays. Coaches need to, in the moment, maybe decide what tactics are appropriate based on what's going on. So it's really important knowledge. Ultimately, what we want to do, though, with our performers is we want them to learn. We want to learn skills and tactics so that they can execute them fairly consistently and permanently. And we need to measure that, we need to give them practice situations so they can work on learning them. And we need to measure improvement so that we can have a sense of how much they have improved or if they have a tool. This is a very brief insight into the ways we learn, though. These are different theories of learning, and these suggest that, firstly, operant conditioning is that we learn by experiencing reinforcement. If your player does something well, as a coach, you give them positive reinforcement, you praise them, you pat them on the back, you smile at them. If your player does something wrong, you remove that positivity, you might change your facial expression, you might stop smiling, you might not give them praise, or you might punish them, you might sub them off, you might make them very old school, do some kind of press-ups or something as a punishment for making the wrong choice. Observational learning is to do with watching people and trying and being motivated to copy their performance. So if, as a coach, I do a demonstration, you as learners copy what I've demonstrated. Or if you see your favorite player do something, you might want to copy them. So we learn by copying people we look up to. Or you might learn by trial and error, experimenting with ways. What different ways can I beat a player in hockey? I might try that way, it doesn't work. I might try a different way, it does work. The last little snippet of sort of additional contextual learning is this stages of learning theory by Fitz and Posner. They suggest basically that there are three levels of, or three standards of performer, three levels of learner. You've got your beginner, your cognitive learner, who relies really heavily on external feedback from the coaches. They don't know what it feels like to do the correct skill themselves. They are very sort of conscious in how they move. They're in their head. They're thinking about how they're moving the whole time. They will get improvement from practice, but early on they look quite uncoordinated, or they're not aesthetic. They're quite clumsy in their movements. They make a lot of errors. As we move into the next phase, this is also called the practice phase, the associative learner, or the intermediate standard. These people kind of know what they're trying to do now. They've got a bit of clarity in their head of what they're trying to achieve. Now they are practicing to refine those movements. They need some external feedback still, but they're getting their own internal feedback about what feels right when they execute a skill. They start to make less errors. They can correct themselves a little bit, and they can recognize sort of when to do these skills. Moving up to the autonomous performer, who is the advanced, experienced, elite performer. Autonomous is a very unconscious state. These players do the skills without really thinking about how they're doing the skills. It's very automatic at this point. They don't need so much external feedback. It's predominantly internal feedback. They know what it feels like to do it right, and they can self-correct. They don't make many errors. They're fairly consistent with their execution of the skill, which means that they can, because it's so automatic to them now, so grooved, they can think about other things. They can think about tactics or deception or strategy. These three stages of learning is really important to discuss when you evaluate your practice situations, your isolated or conditioned or competitive practice situations. So what I've discussed so far is really contextual, almost additional, relevant information that you need to understand to be able to talk about, discuss and evaluate practices. I'm not going to go into any detail whatsoever in this video on these things, but I want to remind you these assignments, this unit is synoptic. It means we're supposed to draw upon information from other units. So when you talk about fitness, if there's anything anatomical you can join in, you can integrate in your discussion, then that's relevant. This is the spec, a lot of the relevant spec for functional anatomy. There should be a lot of opportunity to include psychology information in your discussion, in your evaluation. These are the topics in applied psychology that could be relevant. There are separate videos on these things that I'm not going to go into now. Okay, let's get into the first of the 3 types of practice you need to discuss and evaluate. Isolated practices for skills and for tactics. For skills. Your spec says it's not for tactics, but honestly, I think it can be used for that. Remember, throughout, you've got to discuss and evaluate this type of isolated practice in relation to these 4 criteria. You need to use this language in your discussion. So overtly talk about this practice is practical because, this practical is suitable for these sorts of learners and these sorts of performers because, or this sort of skill because. So make sure you overtly discuss that for higher grade. So what is an isolated practice to develop skill and technique? It is something which isolates a part of a skill or a single skill. I've put the tactics up there and sort of highlighted it because I do believe, beating a player via using a 1-2 in football is a tactic, is a strategy. So I do believe it can be separated and done individually, and I'm happy for you to mention that in your work, but your spec really wants you to focus on skills for this type of practice. So passing to one another in basketball, no defenders, nothing else to think of, just the technique of how to execute it properly. Fairly close together to keep it simple, so there's no additional pressure on how powerful you need to be. That is a simple example of an isolated practice. Another could be practicing layup. So I could teach a layup, introduce layup as a skill, have them demonstrate it and then have them practice one at a time doing a layup, then go to the back of the line. This is an isolated practice. Incidentally, I could break how I teach this down into parts and do progressive part method. I could just stand them under the basket and do the shooting action with the arm. I could then get them to do the hop up where you take off the ground. I could then add a step, there's 2 steps before as part of the takeoff. I could then add a bounce. I could then take them further back and make them dribble in to do their layup. So I could deliver this as a first time either by just have a go, whole practice method, or I could do it progressive part, build up, build up, build up, master that bit and then add another bit on. So what are the characteristics of isolated practices? They are often used to introduce new skills or refine skills. Even if I'm a fairly experienced associative or autonomous performer, I might need to go back and work on my layups. It's very common for basketball players to just do practice layups, even though they're mega skillful. Or tennis players or table tennis or badminton players to just practice serving in isolation. So it doesn't have to just be to introduce a new skill. It could be to almost go back to pick on a particular thing and focus on it. So it gives very specific focus on something. It's often used for the cognitive learners or the beginners. It allows you to break down skills, as I've just said, and focus on parts. It can often be to allow repetition. So repeat practice of something in isolation. It isn't necessarily in a competitive situation. Sometimes competition is distracting when you're trying to learn a skill. You want the people to think about how they're doing it, not if they're going to win. But it can be, and you can make it competitive without being comparative. You can make it about you. So shoot 10 times, how many do you score? And that's about you. And then next time you should do that, can you beat your score as opposed to can you be better than somebody else, which is better? You can obviously adapt these isolated practices to make them easier or more difficult, which we look at in the adaptations part. As I said, I do think it can be used for tactics. You can separate, teach a new tactic. If I was going to teach a new tactic, I would walk them through it in isolation, and then I would bring it to life, and then I would make defenders active. I'd have passive, no defenders at all, or cones or passive defenders, and then build it up. So I do believe it can be tactical as well. I'm not going to go through it right now, but here you can pause the video and have a look through these. These are ways of teaching skills or tactics. I talked about the whole method and the progressive part method when I talked about the layup earlier. Have a look at those. Remember, later on, you've got to plan a session yourself. It could also be good knowledge to integrate in terms of these, the next 4 types of practice methods. Do you do master practice methods where you practice repeatedly with no breaks? But there are pros and cons to that, which you can see on this slide you can look at. Or do you practice with rest intervals, which is called distributed practices? Similarly, do you practice with fixed conditions, i.e. the same conditions? Stuff like free throw is only ever taken from the free throw line. It's a fixed situation. Whereas shooting, generally in basketball or hockey or football, you shoot from all different angles. So at some point you've got to vary the practice conditions, practice in different places. You might learn passing in a fixed situation with 2 people facing each other. But then what you might do is later, when they've got the idea of how to pass, make a more variable practice condition where they've got to pass on the move or pass in different directions, pass around different distances or around people. That's more realistic as it is in the game. So what are the pros and cons of isolated practice? You can take your time and look at these more closely, but they really give opportunity to master a skill, to get it, to perfect it, to get it right, whilst removing a lot of the distracting pressures, removing intensity and pressure, managing arousal levels. They can be really inclusive. It's not competitive. Everybody's involved. It allows you to focus on how you do the skills, how you prepare, you execute and recover from the skill. But what it doesn't do is offer you game intensity, game realism. And we need to build up that at some point before you do compete and play in full game situation. It might be a bit boring, it might be a bit slow, it's a bit repetitive. It's important for learning, but you've got to be careful that you don't bore your participants and they disengage altogether. So you've got to build a variety of in-practice situations, and if you just do the same isolated situations, it can be boring. So please be mindful that you've got to evaluate your practices, your examples using these criteria. Ultimately, for your assessment, you need to include in this section for isolated practices 2 examples of practices from 2 different sports. So only 2 in total, but they've got to be from 2 different sports. And when you explain them in your assignment, you've got to explain them in terms of what they're aiming to achieve, what equipment you need, what numbers players you know, is it just 1 person? Do you need 5 people? How much space you need? I want you to include a diagram that you can then talk about. Remember, it will be captioned, wrapped and captioned. Think about how you can differentiate it as well. This will be more to do with the adaptation stuff, where you'll include it, but think about, can you alter how it's presented? And you've got to evaluate your practice. Is it practical, suitable for whom, relevant for whom, or what skills? And is it effective and why? The next section, or the next type of practice situation, is called conditioned practice situations. So first of all, we need to know, what do we mean by a condition? Well, this is how coaches move their players away from isolated, safe, contained, restricted practice situations, slightly more towards the real competitive situation. But the coach may apply conditions to how performance is done, how the practice is going to work. For example, they might change the scoring area. So I might, instead of having 1 goal at each end, I might have goals in each 4 corners. I might have smaller goals. I might have targets in the goals. I might have targets on my badminton court. I might have certain areas of my badminton court out of bounds. So I might change the space that I'm using. I might not use the whole pitch. I might use a small area. I might make it bigger or smaller to make it more challenging for fitness. I might modify the scoring. So if I'm teaching shooting in basketball, I might have 5 points for a layup and only a normal 2 points for a normal shot, because I want them to practice layups in our conditioned situation. I might manipulate the sides. I might say you've got to all touch the ball before you can try and score. So those are almost made up rules that the coach puts in place for a particular reason, to achieve something. So I'm sure in your own practice experience, you've experienced conditioned situations. You might have players around the outside, and these white and red team have to use the green teammates on the outside as additional players and make a certain number of passes before they try to score. This is netball, and instead of having goals at each end, you've got zones to manipulate the game in a certain way for practice. I've talked about basketball. So if I want my players to practice layups, again, I could say the condition is we're playing 3v3, half court, but the defenders are only allowed to defend by where they position themselves. They can't use their arms. So that condition restricts the defenders, gives the attackers an advantage, because I want my attackers to feel confident to practice. I could limit where my defender is allowed to defend. I could say you can only score using a layup. I could say layups are worth 10 points because I want to emphasize its importance. I could say I'm going to give you 10 points if you score the layup with good technique, but I'm going to give you 5 points even if you miss, but you do good technique. I could give 20 points for using your weak hand to do a layup. So these are all conditions and rules that I'm applying to promote the use of layup, not in a fully competitive situation, by a modified situation. I can use these also for tactics. So I could teach what we call a screen. So one player helps another player get free, basically, in basketball. And I could say, okay, you get a point, no baskets, don't shoot, so it's just half court possession, and you get a point every time you screen for a different person or your team does a screen for your teammate. I could say you've got to screen twice before you try and score. So they're made up conditions that I'm applying to the play to manipulate what goes on to promote whatever I want to promote, the skill or the tactic. So here are the characteristics. So I appreciate it's quite small. I appreciate it's a lot. Again, please pause the video and look at it quite properly. But to summarize, really, this is now us moving towards more performance norm, the realistic situation. You're not necessarily going to use the real rules of the sport. You're going to make up your own conditions or rules artificially. You're going to create situations that work for what you're trying to achieve. We're now trying to transfer the skills or tactics we've been learning into a slightly more realistic competitive situation by manipulating the conditions. You might modify the space, you might modify the number. You're going to still be giving a lot of guidance and feedback and reinforcing their behavior, but you want them to understand how to use the skill in a more realistic situation and practice it in a more realistic situation. These kinds of situations are really quite engaging for players and more motivating and more fun in a way. It can also, of course, be used for tactics to replicate set plays. You've got to use this, we're going to play half pitch, we're going to do lots of line out practice. We're teaching them to know when to do, so to recognize the situation where they should apply a certain tactic, how often it might occur, to be able to reflect upon it, how it works successfully, and to obviously practice executing the tactic properly. So that tactical awareness is really important. Why is this good? This sort of conditioned practice situation good? Wow, we're beginning to increase the perceptual demand on our player. We're making them think a lot more, having to weigh up when and how to do things in a more realistic situation. It's more fun and dynamic. They've got to solve the problem. They've got to make decisions. They've got to recognize when what the trigger is to do the skill or the tactic. It's much more variable. It becomes a bit more unpredictable than the isolated practices. It's more realistic. Coaches can manipulate it. You might watch a practice happening and think, there's too many loopy passes in netball. Right, I'm going to add the condition that must be below head height passing only. So it can be controlled competition. But of course, the coach can still coach and intervene. And again, what you don't want is too many conditions, because players will forget what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So you've got to be quite selective what you choose to do and why. You could, if you need to, you could choose conditions to make sure everybody in a team or in a practice is included, because sometimes dominant players can be, domineering and exclude other players. So remember, you've got to evaluate your 2 practices, examples, using these 4 criteria. But the requirements of the assignment are for you to have 2 conditioned situations of examples. One of them must be a skill from a particular sport, and one of them must be a tactic from a different sport. So in total, 2 examples, one must be a skill, one must be a tactic, but they must be from different sports. And again, explain them by saying what you're trying to achieve, how do you make it work, how does it build on the isolated practice that you may have done already, what equipment, what numbers, what space, knowing that at some point you're going to have to talk about how you make it harder or easier, but you've got to evaluate it using those criteria. I'm not going to go into any detail at all now about these, but just a reminder that these are the sorts of bit of sports psychology that you can access through the other synoptic video on the playlist that might be applicable to the sorts of competitive or conditioned situations that we're talking about. Coaches influence what sort of vibe is in the space, what sort of climate. Is it a mastery or a competitive climate? If you only ever set competitive situations or you compare the players to each other, you're creating a competitive climate. We know this acronym TARGET can partly be used to discuss what you do in your practice situations. Do you set variable, differentiated, self-referenced practices? Do you recognize and reward improvement and effort, or is it just those who are better, and by comparing who's best, who's not so good? Do you group by mixed ability and do cooperative training so that they can help each other? The less able can help the more able can help perhaps the less able, or do you group by ability, which can be a bit counterproductive? We also talk about goal achievement orientation, so achievement goal theory. Are your players more mastery orientated, i.e. they perceive success as improvement in themselves? They don't need to judge themselves by comparing to each other. They just want to work hard and improve their own skills and performance. Or are they more outcome or ego orientated, i.e. they judge success only if they're better than others. If they're not better than others, they're failing in some ways. And this is really important because those orientations can have an impact on how they try, how persistent or resilient they are, what choices they make in terms of challenging themselves, and ultimately their performance. The last little bit of theory that could be relevant to this bit is mindset, growth or fixed mindset. Growth mindset is the healthier, positive option. We want players to believe that whatever ability or performance standard they are now, if they try hard and work hard and practice hard, they can get better. That feedback is important for progress, that failing in some way or losing perhaps doesn't mean it's all over and they're never going to get better. It's just an opportunity and a challenge to get better versus the fixed mindset. And you as coaches are really key in relating to those. Okay, so the last type of practice situation is competitive situation. So we've moved from isolated through into conditioned, and now the step sort of before full competition is a competitive situation. And this is applicable to skills and tactics. So I might set a practice set whereby I've got players practicing offensive and defensive positioning as a tactic in badminton. This is defensive side by side. They switch to offensive. They stay in offensive. The others are in defensive. They adjust defensive based on the play that's going on. Now, what that isn't is a full match. That is a situation that I've created. It could be play first to 5 points. It could be play for 5 minutes, practicing that particular strategy or tactic. Obviously, that can be applied to all sorts of different sports. You could have a modified competitive situation, not using the full football pitch, but having a 5v5. Again, it's a competitive situation, not the full thing, not the full pressure, not the full team, but something that exposes players to an even more realistic situation. Similarly, in basketball, we could play 3v3 half court. So again, we've been working on shooting, we've been working on layups. We're going to now play half court, 3v3. That's a competitive situation. What we would do perhaps then is build up to 4v4 full court and then ultimately 5v5. So those progressive steps to take you nearer and nearer the realistic situation. If I wanted to apply my basket tactics, my set play of screening, again, we could play 3v3 half court, so not full teams, not full court, but what we might be practicing within this competitive situation is giving the commands for what screen we're going to do. So shouting out X for an off-ball screen, shouting out Y for an on-ball screen to get people play. And that is just, again, a competitive situation that enables us to practice this specific tactic. So what are the characteristics of competitive situations? Now we're creating specific elements of competitive situations or practicing things in mimicking reality. We're following by the normal rules. We're applying the skills or the tactics or the techniques to realistic competitive situations, but not necessarily the full team and the full space. This gives us a chance to rehearse situations like that tactic of screening or a set play. So it gives us realistic scenarios to practice what could happen in reality. The psychological demands are relatively high, and now it gives us, again, a more full demand placed upon us. We've got to cope with these levels of stresses and situations and perception. Play in competitive situation is very open. Remember those types of skills, closed or open. Now you've got to do your shooting, your passing, your dribbling in open situations. You're forced to create your own sort of reality and your own opportunities in this open situation. We want players to learn how to transfer what they've learned from their safe, isolated practice through their conditioned practice into competitive practice situations. So it's about applying what they've learned now into reality, practicing offense, practicing defense. You can focus on either of those in a competitive situation. It doesn't have to be just a free-for-all. You can still have specific focuses. So what are the advantages of competitive practice situations? Half of them we've explained already. It's rehearsing reality, it's practicing and transferring learning into reality. Doesn't need to be full court, that's a good thing. It gives players opportunities to practice being composed in stressful situations. The risk is you lose quality of performance. Maybe it gets a bit chaotic, maybe it's too soon, maybe it's a bit overwhelming. We don't want them to lose focus on how they're playing, how they're applying their skills, and that's again a risk that it becomes more about the winning or the losing. It could be that the teams are imbalanced and biased, or people become a bit more dominant. Maybe you need to go back a step and apply a condition to deal with that. It requires probably higher levels of fitness to be able to maintain the skill quality. When you get tired in competitive situations, maybe you play a bit worse. And maybe your players were, maybe you misjudged it. Some people might be right and ready for this situation, some might not be, and that might have a negative consequence, and you can discuss that. So for your assessment, you've got to explain 2 competitive situations, one for a skill and one for a tactic from different sports. So one skill, one tactic, competitive situation, so 2 in total. Remembering that you've got to do exactly the same. Explain what's the intention, what you need, what space, etc., etc. You've got to evaluate this practice situation, referring to these 4 criteria, plus other things. Remember to integrate your psychology. The last point I'd like to make is, if I'm judging your work, I expect to see you writing a rainbow. There should be some factual statements there, which you then go on to explain through your examples. So you might give some facts about the characteristics of practices. You explain through your 2 examples. You evaluate using those criteria and other related information like that stages of learning content, the skills, the practice methods, must, fixed, variable, open, close skills. And what I very much want is some synoptic content, self-confidence, self-efficacy, arousal theories, attention field, group dynamics, knowing your role, social task cohesion. Okay, and obviously the quality of your work is matters as well with what you do. So think about, have you written a rainbow for each of these sections and parts? Have you described, explained through your examples, evaluated these examples and each type of practice? Have you integrated relevant other stuff, other synoptic content?